This phone, the Galaxy S21 Ultra, is my current camera champion. It's well ahead of Samsung's last phone. It beat out the iPhone 12 Pro Max, but now we've got a new contender, the Hasselblad-branded, camera-centric OnePlus 9 Pro. We've got 12 short categories leading up to one winner, the best phone camera ever. So, when I compared this Samsung to the iPhone a few months ago, the simple fact that Samsung's camera had so many features just gave it a slightly higher starting point. But that's not the case here. For almost every interesting thing the Samsung can do, like hyperlapses or portrait mode video, OnePlus can do them too, sometimes better. So, in terms of software features, they're pretty neck and neck. But the secret sauce of what makes Samsung's camera so fun is that it's not just software. The entire hardware, every lens that's picked here, are built around trying to give you options. Like how the ultra-wide camera is made to double as a super close-up macro camera. Good news for OnePlus fans, this has that too. It's just not as good. The quality of close-ups is comparable, as you can probably tell, but Samsung's phone can get like twice as close, which is the entire objective of a macro camera. This applies to zoom as well. Both can do it. The OnePlus 9 Pro has a pretty good 3.3x optical zoom camera, but the Samsung is built to zoom at extreme levels, with both a 3 times and a 10 times zoom camera. So, it shouldn't surprise you that Samsung can go further. If you put both phones side by side and slowly zoom in, then as soon as you pass 10 times and Samsung's main telephoto camera kicks in, it's in a completely different league. Yes, Samsung's footage does start to look a bit like a watercolor painting when you get to 30x, but by the time you get to 30x on OnePlus, you can count the pixels. But I am curious about something. When you take zoom shots on your phone, how often do you find that you actually want to go past 10 times? Like, I'd imagine if I had to guess that the majority of people when they're zooming in, they'd probably go closer to 5x, 6x, or 7x. But yeah, I mean, the Samsung still looks better. It takes better selfies too. There is an element of personal preference here, but I can't help but feel like OnePlus is inventing colours that weren't there. And even selfie video. For some bizarre reason, the OnePlus 9 Pro maxes out at 1080p of pretty mixed quality footage on the front camera, which means that if all you wanted it for was Instagram, it's serviceable. But it straight away means that unless 4K gets added in a software update, I pretty much can't recommend this phone to anyone who's planning on doing any kind of vlogging. If you're buying a flagship phone now in 2021, you'll probably be using it till 2024, and I think by then 1080p footage is gonna feel like a relic. And this is an audio test. So right now you're listening to the OnePlus microphone. This is what that sounds like. And now you're listening to the Samsung. They're both very good, to be honest. I don't think the microphones on any one of these phones is a reason to pick one over the other. Okay, this is OnePlus's big chance to come back. General photography. In all of the teasers and promotional material for this phone, the overarching message was this: we heard you didn't like our past cameras, we fixed them. Oh, and did we tell you that we partnered up with Hasselblad? So far, we've looked at zoom, we've looked at selfies, and a couple of other things, but the only 2 cameras that Hasselblad has had any involvement in are the main 2 cameras, the wide and the ultra-wide. So, given that Hasselblad is almost regarded as an authority on photography, are they any good? Well, when I first started pulling up side-by-sides of these 2 phones, I had a couple of moments of, wait, have I just pulled open the same photo twice? Both phones are stylistically aiming for the same kind of finish. But then I started noticing things. First of all, OnePlus tends to crush darker areas. Like if you look at my trousers in this shot here, it almost looks like someone's just doodled a black silhouette on top. It's not always a bad thing to underexpose subjects, but more often than not when you put the OnePlus in a challenging situation, its photos just look a little bit too dark. Yes, I realise I'm basically having a wedding photo shoot for one, but hey, if I'm having 200 photos taken, I might as well look good in them. And if you are enjoying this video, then a sub to the channel would be smooth. Secondly, OnePlus adds a lot of sharpening. You notice it a lot in backgrounds. While Samsung is perfectly happy to let trees behind you sort of blur away a little bit, OnePlus wants to keep everything in the frame sharp. Mind you, it's not necessarily a bad thing. This extra sharpness, I think it does come in handy when you're in those lower light indoor situations, where photos start to look a little soft otherwise. And to OnePlus's credit, this is a much faster camera. When you tap that shutter button, you're literally capturing a photo in half the time. And it almost makes this feel like I'm using two phones from different weight classes, a middleweight versus a heavyweight. The main problem, though, that I'm having with this OnePlus camera is that I can't trust it. Like, this is me trying to very literally monkey around, and in all three shots, while the Samsung retains a fairly consistent look, the OnePlus just completely flips the way the image comes out, depending on where you're standing. It's better than their past phones, but it's still not quite at a stage where I can just snap a photo and be confident in the fact that it's come out okay. And this applies to the ultra-wide camera too. It's fairly accepted that as you move between different camera lenses, you're going to experience some color shift. But this is an enormous shift, especially for a phone that's branded as being calibrated to an exact color science. Also, OnePlus did talk a fair bit about how their new ultra-wide removes distortion around the edges, but honestly, compared to the Samsung, they're pretty comparable. These are both good cameras for photos, but if someone said to me that I could only use one phone for photos for the rest of my life, it would be the Samsung. And at the risk of this sounding like OnePlus has just showed up to the wrong tournament, this applies to portrait mode too. Like, this photo here was our third attempt on the OnePlus. It took two other photos that looked more like this before we got to that. And OnePlus's edge detection is almost always worse. Or here, not only does OnePlus's color profile shift yet again between shots, but on one of them it just decided that I was meant to be the background. Ouch. To be clear, I'm not saying that Samsung is particularly good at portrait mode. It's actually one of this phone's main weaknesses too. It's just that I'm finding that the OnePlus is even less consistent. However, there's one thing that we've got to give it. It's the fact that because it's capturing faster, its portraits are much more likely to be crisp, even if they do have more irregularities. It still blows my mind though that we've got two phones here which both have telephoto cameras, and yet for portrait mode they insist on using the main camera and then digitally zooming in. We'll call this category a draw. Before we can crown either of these king, we've got to talk about video. And you actually find that a lot of the traits we saw with photos kind of come through here. Both very capable, but even though OnePlus has a bunch of new features like dual HDR, it still crushes the darker areas and sometimes overexposes the brighter areas. It's not that OnePlus is doing a bad job. This phone would hold its own in video against most 2021 smartphones, but it's just that right now we're comparing it against what's probably the second best phone camera for video, apart from the iPhone, and at that level, it is behind. It doesn't seem to focus quite as well. Like in this situation, we were trying to set up a shot, and it took like a full minute to get the OnePlus to actually lock focus on it, whereas it was done within 5 seconds on the Samsung. And whilst with the Samsung you can use your telephoto cameras to take video, so you can record at 3x zoom and 10x zoom at 4K, OnePlus doesn't let you, which means that as soon as you apply even minor levels of zoom in video, it looks bad. It does have one interesting feature though. When you get to low light, you can turn on something called nightscape video, which does mean brighter, cleaner nighttime footage. But I'm a little torn about it. On one hand, it can make things look prettier, but on the other hand, it seems to make the camera very averse to motion, which can make the footage look a little jumpy. And you see the same traits echoing in slow motion too. It looks like OnePlus is almost trying to compensate for the lack of resolution by dialing up the contrast. But again, it's crushing the blacks. Samsung does take this a little further. It gives you the option to record short bursts of super slow-mo. But to be honest, given that we're now in 2021, and given that this feature hasn't dramatically improved in quality since the Galaxy S9, it's starting to look a little rough. I'm sure with the power of this phone that 1080p footage at that frame rate is possible. It feels like they don't care about slow-mo anymore. Anyways, two final things. One, they're both stable phones. I tried walking while both phones were following me, and I even tried legging it. Apologies to the bride, but both phones seem to be similarly affected by motion. And two, you might be wondering, is there anything that the OnePlus actually wins at? Well, yes there is, and it's probably my favorite category, nighttime photos. There's just something very satisfying about seeing a really dark, grainy scene and then watching as your phone slowly pieces it together into something bright and cohesive. Samsung goes for extreme smoothness, like it's trying to make sure there's not a single bit of grain in sight, but the result of that is that you do lose texture on objects, and so OnePlus overtakes it in detail at night. Plus, I think the cooler tones on both the main camera and the ultra-wide, as well as the phone's ability to better control the bright spots, lends its photos a cleaner look. but this is personal preference. I think Samsung's photos look more accurate, but I think OnePlus's look better. So, on one hand, this has been a bit of a whitewash. Samsung has just beaten OnePlus by almost every single metric. But there's something we need to bear in mind, that yes, whilst the OnePlus 9 Pro is the highest end phone that OnePlus makes, it's still significantly cheaper than the highest end phone that Samsung makes. And so even though there's very little that I could point to and say that, oh, OnePlus does this better, there is some credit to be had in the fact that in a lot of situations it is as good or not much worse. So the message to take away from this video is that A, the Galaxy S21 Ultra still definitely has the throne, but also that B, the OnePlus 9 Pro is not a bad camera system. It's about what you would expect for its price. If Samsung was an A+, then this would be a B+, maybe even an A-. And so for the sake of a $200 gap, that might be worth it for you. Okay, thank you so much for watching. I'm trying to improve on this whole camera comparison concept. Let me know if it worked. My name is Aaron, this is Mr. Who's the Boss, and I'll catch you in the next one.